Hey everyone, this is a review of the progress being made on the Paris Accord as of late 2019 and early 2020. Recall from previous units where we learned about the possible futures ahead of us based on whether, when, and how quickly we begin to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the burning of fossil fuels and other activities such as deforestation. We saw this particular graph earlier. These lines represent greenhouse gas accumulation in the atmosphere for four future scenarios known as RCPs, or representative concentration pathways. Note that the present decade is critically important for determining the future of humanity for many centuries to come. Currently, our greenhouse gas emissions are matching the red line, or RCP 8.5, a pathway that will trigger catastrophic change to Earth's climate. This slide shows what's meant by catastrophic change. We've already reviewed this diagram, but I have it here to emphasize that we are where the red arrow is indicating, that is, on the brink of sending Earth into what's known as a hothouse Earth climate, in which over the span of the next few decades to centuries, the Earth's climate changes radically and sea levels rise many dozens of feet. The Paris Accord was adopted by the United Nations in 2015 as the latest international effort to cooperate to slow and ultimately reverse greenhouse gas emissions. Previous agreements, such as the Kyoto Agreement, failed to bring unity because of disagreements on setting mandatory targets for emissions reductions. Much of the tension arose from tensions between developed and developing nations. Developing nations, such as India, want to fully modernize their economy and have been attracted to fossil fuels as the energy source to do that industrialization. They reasonably argue that the developed nations, such as the United States and most of Europe, all of whom modernized using cheap fossil fuels, should help pay for developing nations to adopt renewable energy technology. Seems reasonable given how much developed nations have exploited the human and natural resources of many developing nations for the past few centuries. The United Nations delegations that crafted the Paris Climate Agreement, often called the Paris Accord, took a different approach. Instead of developing required mandatory emissions reductions, each country is to volunteer to make emission reductions. This shift left to the successful development of the treaty, which is the most ambitious climate agreement to date, and was the cause for great hope and optimism. There are, however, significant problems that have developed since. To begin with, one of the first actions taken by Donald Trump as President of the United States was to declare that the U.S. would not sign the Paris Accord and would withdraw from the agreement. That puts us in a category with Syria and Nicaragua as the only other nations refusing to sign the accord. Nicaragua and Syria are minor players in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but the U.S. is the second largest emitter of greenhouse gases at 14% of global emissions. By the way, China leads at 29%. The other issue is that countries are not volunteering to cut back enough emissions to reach climate targets. The goals of the Paris Accord are to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius relative to pre-industrial levels. That is, average global temperature before the Industrial Revolution. 2 degrees Celsius is the level beyond which climate scientists say that we are at risk of hitting numerous tipping points in Earth's systems that lead us into a hothouse Earth climate scenario. However, warming of 2 degrees Celsius would still lead to major disruptions to many cities and countries around the world. In fact, some small low-lying nations would all but disappear beneath rising seas. Thus, UN delegates agreed to an aspirational goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which would result in significantly less disruption. This graphic from September 2019 illustrates where we are in the progress of signatory nations volunteering enough emissions reductions to keep warming below the 2 and 1.5 degrees Celsius thresholds. The main graph at the center of the slide shows time on the x-axis and gigatons of greenhouse gases on the y-axis in terms of CO2 equivalencies. The lines on the graph show different future scenarios based on whether and how much signatory nations cut back their emissions of greenhouse gases. Shading around each line indicates margins of error. The green arrows indicate the levels of emissions we need to have to hit 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius targets. The red arrow indicates the scenario where there is no international agreement at all to limit emissions. This is considered a baseline scenario. The pink arrow indicates the current policy scenario, which is the path we are on now based on current levels of commitments to the Paris Accord on emissions reductions. Over to the right of the graphic, we see a measure of how far off the mark we are. Measures of this are called emissions gaps. The yellow arrow indicates the gap between where we are headed and keeping global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. The purple arrow indicates how far we will be from staying below the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. The gray circles indicate how much we are off the mark in terms of gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalencies for either one of the thresholds. As a side note, the conditional and unconditional scenarios in dark brown and light brown refer to different conditions of the Paris Accord that have to do with whether and to what extent developed nations share resources, including technology, with the developing nations. Don't worry about those details for this class. Taken as a whole, the important message from this graphic is that we are not on track for meeting the goals of the Paris Accord. Instead, we're on track for substantial global warming. This pathway is leading us right to the verge of pushing Earth into a hothouse Earth climate scenario that is expected to last for many centuries, possibly millennia.